Hello, I'm Abby Beck, a PhD candidate in civil engineering at the University of Illinois, and today I'll be discussing our work on the incorporation of equity into infrastructure decision-making, the development of an equity metric for infrastructure retrofitting. I'll first go over the motivation and background, then a discussion on existing metrics, followed by the discussion of the methodology of our new metric and its application to a hypothetical study region, and I'll finish with a brief discussion on conclusions and the direction of our future work. I first want to establish infrastructure's critical role in community resilience to support why equity is also important in infrastructure decisions. So community resilience is defined as a community's ability to prepare for a hazard, to withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions, and to adapt to changing conditions. And in light of this definition, community resilience reveres the support of the entire community's functionality at a holistic level. Therefore, community resilience conscious decisions should consider broader impacts. And some of those broader impacts apply to infrastructure. And we know that post-disaster infrastructure service failures can lead to widespread adverse impacts. As such, infrastructure plays a critical role in dictating the community's resilience. And community resilience can be improved through infrastructure decisions for pre-event disaster risk reduction measures and post-event restoration plans. And now that we know the connection between infrastructure and community resilience is strong and established, why also do we need to consider equity too? And so after natural disasters such as Winter Storm Uri in Texas or Hurricane Irma in Florida and Hurricane Harvey in Houston, disproportionate outage impacts have been documented to occur on vulnerable groups. And in order to best support community resilience, that is knowing that the whole holistic community is supported, these inequities need to be considered in our infrastructure decisions. Therefore, equity really should be incorporated into our decision-making process for infrastructure. However, the challenge of incorporating equity considerations is that equity is not singularly defined, but it is best defined through 5 dimensions that I'll briefly walk through now. The first of which is recognitional, which is the acknowledgement and respect of different marginalized population subsets and inequities they face. This recognition really drives the structuring of actions to support inequities reduction. The next is distributional, which is the fair distribution of resources or services across a community, and it's often termed as equality. The next is restorative, which is the prioritization of those who have been historically marginalized and often still face marginalization in order to rectify past harms. The next is procedural, which represents the inclusion and equal consideration of all perspectives in a decision-making process and is routinely achieved through the modified policies and rules that govern the process. And the last is transgenerational, which represents the fair distribution of burden to all generations, and that no unfair burden is placed on a future generation or a subset of that generation. And so, however, the derived metric we'll focus on today is the restorative dimension, as it is currently not well supported and primed for development. And so with this dimension in mind, infrastructure assessment and decision-making for retrofit prioritization with the restorative equity paradigm dictates the equitable reduction of outage impacts. And so there has been limited work on existing equity metrics that can be broadly grouped into the following 3 classes. The first of which are threshold-based, which strive to improve or reduce the percentage of community meeting a threshold service or provision. And these have generally been applied for equal service provision, yet really do little to recognize the often large service provision gaps between the least and most vulnerable. The next are min-max, which strive to equitably reduce the difference in service provision. And these can be tailored for comparison between groups of concern, yet outliers can really skew the interpretation, and we don't know how much is necessarily at one end of the scale or not. The last is the Gini index, which measures the distribution of resource across a community and how that deviates from a perfect equal distribution. And it's favored for its bounded 0 to 1 values and that they're easy to interpret. However, it really only produces one aggregate metric with no differentiation between vulnerable groups of concern. And so most of these 3 metrics, families of metrics, are not well suited to deal with the restorative concerns of prioritizing certain subsets, but do necessarily reflect the distributional equity concern quite well to make an equal provision to all entities. And so therefore, we believe that a tiles T-based metric is preferred to address the restorative equity concerns, since it can represent an equity's attribution between vulnerable groups of concern. And so tiles T is an entropy-based measure to quantify the inequality present and the dispersion of a scarce resource, that scarce resource being income, and it's classically been done for income inequality originating in the economic sector. But what really enables this metric to support restorative equity, it is that is decomposable into between zone inequality, BZI, and within zone inequality. And so BZI is defined as the amount of inequality due to resource differences between groups, while WZI is defined as the amount of inequality due to resource differences among a singular group. And you will note that I am saying inequality here. And yes, these metrics do measure the inequality in a scarce resources distribution, but what really allows it to assess the equity is that it is decomposable relative to groups of concern to indicate on the inequity between those groups. And so this is really the difference, this difference between the groups that we are concerned with. Additionally, tiles also offers other benefits, such as that it shows scale invariance, it upholds Dalton's principle of transfers, and it's sensitive to transfers at the lower end of the scale. And so the metrics are defined as follows, with tiles T being the total inequality present in a scarce resources distribution, and it ranges from 0 to a max value of the log n, and being the total number of entities being considered. And it's defined by the sum of both the BZI term and the WZI term. And so BZI is determined by summing each zone's scarce resource share of the cumulative amount of resource multiplied the log of that zone's mean amount of resource divided by the overall mean amount of scarce resource. While the WZI is determined by summing across each zone's collective scarce resource share of the cumulative amount that is then multiplied by the sum of all the individuals' resource shares of that group's cumulative amount of resource. And this is then further multiplied by the log of the individual's resource amount divided by that zone's mean resource amount. However, one common critique of the tiles and its metric is that its values are unbounded, making it very difficult to interpret consistently. So to overcome this and increase the interpretability and implementation feasibility into a decision problem, the metrics are transformed to a relative terms by dividing by their own respective max values in order to then render them relative so that they varying between 0 and 1. And so then the challenge really becomes on how to define what is a scarce resource for infrastructure decision making. And so we first need to keep in mind that a scarce resource should be at a resolution to allow for decomposition into vulnerable and non-vulnerable subsets relative to certain characteristics of concern, such as low income and non-low income. That's how we're going to assess the inequity. So we really need to make sure that it is decomposable. The second of which is something like the age of an entity's nearest infrastructure component is not a proper scarce resource due to a potential loss of compounding system vulnerability that would be lost by only seeing what is exactly next to a certain facility. So for these reasons, for infrastructure application, the scarce resource could be taken as a household structure's likelihood of outage or probability of outage. And so this is believed to be an appropriate scarce resource because we know that budget scarcity is present and budget limitations primarily govern infrastructure system risk mitigations, such as retrofitting. Therefore, decisions on budgetary resource allocation for retrofits are required. And once certain retrofits are selected, these actions alter infrastructure system functionality, and the functionality of a component dictates its outage likelihood. And outage likelihood is a better indicator of impact, since we know that those experiencing lots of outages also tend to be most impacted from the studies referenced earlier in this presentation. And in this way, outage likelihood can be a good scarce resource for this restorative equity consideration in order to reduce the amounts of impact across a community. And so the scarce resource is computed via system reliability. And so in this formulation, all the infrastructure components functionings required to provide service to a structure are considered. And so this is set up in a series system of probability of failure. And so each component's individual probability of survival that is used to calculate the probability of failure is determined via use of total probability theorem by accounting for its fragility in combination with the extreme hazard distribution of interest. And so this can be found for every single structure considered and represents the scarce resource. And the current formulation for the probability of outage neglects network redundancies and serves as the lower bound estimates for service inequality. However, in future work with more computational burden, a parallel system formulation could be found and utilized. And so we then apply this metric to a hypothetical compact electric distribution network for a wind event. And so this application allows us to ensure that the metric is aptly picking up on the inequities in service provision. And so the inequity is not assessed between sociodemographic characteristics due to the small area, but rather the inequity is assessed relative to two zones dictated by the network topology. And so pole age is intrinsically varied to simulate differing amounts of inequity between the two zones with age-dependent fragilities. And so we go through scenarios where both zones are assigned the same age and also varying age to understand how the metric is picking up on the inequity in the system. And so across all the scenarios, the values are tabulated across all of the metric values. And the first thing I will draw your attention to is the relative tiles T, the overall amount of inequality benchmarked in the system. And here we see that the varying age scenarios have markedly higher values relative to the uniform scenarios, benchmarking more inequality in the system. The second thing I'll draw your attention to is the decomposition into BZI and WZI terms. And so from this, we see that the majority of the inequality in the uniform scenarios is attributed to the within zone differences. So what is just there different because of the network, while an increasing amount of the inequality is attributed to BZI in the varying scenarios. So this difference is attributed to differences between these groups. And so together, both of these trends and characteristics confirm that the tiles T metric is identifying the inequity as expected, as we're seeing more BZI attributed to the varying scenarios and higher amounts of inequality attributed to the varying scenarios. But now I want to dig a little bit more closely at the metric's performance across varying degrees of inequity. And so the plot on the left here displays the decomposition across the varying scenarios, while the plot on the right displays the tiles T value, so the overall amount, and then the BZI value, so the one singular component of the tiles T, and so across all the different zone age gaps. And so the first thing I will draw your attention to is that as these zone differences continue to increase, the age gap is increasing, we continue to see the amount of BZI, the amount of inequity that's present between these two groups does continue to increase. The second thing I will draw your attention to is that there is a large gap between the zone 1 varied older and zone 2 varied older. And this is attributed to the sensitivity of transfers at the lower end of the scale. So zone 1 serves approximately 2/3 of the network, while zone 2 serves 1/3. And so when the smaller zone 2 is varied older, this is viewed as being at the lower end of the scale. So when it is varied older, it's being in a more inequitable state. And so this makes the metric helpful to investigate inequity between vulnerable minority and less vulnerable majority. And so the last thing I will draw your attention to is this dip that we see here and the overall amount of inequality benchmarked through the tiles T. And this is attributed to overall severe component aging. But what's important to note is that the BZI continues to increase here, indicating that the metrics are still performing for the restorative equity benefit as intended. And so ultimately from these, we see that both the BZI relative and tiles T relative are most important for integration into the decision problem. The BZI to make sure that we're highlighting the restorative concerns, and the tiles T to make sure that we're not inadvertently increasing the amount of inequality in the system due to our decisions. And so these metrics can help to identify which sets of retrofits would best improve the equity across the system. And so now in conclusion, I just want to say that the tiles T and decomposition derived metrics are thought to best support the restorative equity paradigm. The adaptation of a scarce resource for infrastructure decision-making is enabled through the system reliability computation. The application to the hypothetical compact electric network verifies the metric's ability to interpret infrastructure inequity. Future applications should investigate alternative decompositions, maybe with sociodemographics or network zone variables, and an alternative scarce resource should be explored. And we hope to examine how equities inclusion impacts the retrofit prioritization and compares against other traditional prioritization schemes. And thank you all very much for your time.